What happens when a man who once had the world at his feet loses it all? This is the haunting story of Diddy's fall from grace, a tale of fame, power, and the crushing weight of a system designed to break even the strongest. From the whispers of his name in the halls to the chilling silence of his cell, witness the unraveling of a man who learned the hard way that no one is untouchable. This is the raw, unfiltered truth behind the headlines. A story that will stay with you long after the screen fades to black. You could feel the change in the air when Diddy entered the detention center that gray October morning. For weeks, everyone had been whispering his name in the hallways and among the gods. And this wasn't just any prisoner. This was a man who once had the world at his feet, someone whose fame and fortune made him feel untouchable. However, the man who emerged from that van wasn't what I had anticipated. He didn't look like he still believed he mattered. His shoulders were slouched, his steps were slow and deliberate, and his face was blank, but not in a way that suggested defiance. Rather, it was more like resignation. You're going to hear the truth about what happens when a man like that falls. And the story of his time inside this detention center will haunt you long after this video ends. If you enjoy stories like this and are interested in the unvarnished, unfiltered realities behind the headlines, subscribe to this channel. Now, let me take you back to that October morning when Diddy's world fell apart. The van arrived shortly after sunrise, and it was one of those mornings when the clouds hung low, pressing against the horizon. A few guards, including myself, stood near the gates, listening in silence as the car approached, and the sound of the engine reverberated in the stillness drawing. Inmates looking curiously out of their dirty windows when the doors opened, Diddy cautiously emerged with his hands shackled in front of him. He paused for a little moment, looking around as if he was trying to figure out where he was. No photographers were present. There were no people yelling his name or cameras flashing, only the sound of the gate closing behind him and the distant whispers of gods. The stench of damp concrete, perspiration, and decay must have been the first thing he noticed. The walls were cracked and coated in dirt splatters. The flooring were discolored from decades of neglect, and the air felt heavy and humid as though it couldn't even leave the area because the hallways were small and poorly illuminated. Even after years of working here, I couldn't get rid of the stifling atmosphere created by the flickering fluorescent lights casting weird shadows on the walls. This wasn't a place for redemption. Rather, it was a place where men came to disappear. Diddy went through the intake process quietly, nodding at instructions, answering in low tones, and accepting the orange jumpsuit with a small resigned sigh. The other guards didn't say much, but their glances told us enough that we all knew who he was. The fingerprints, photos, and standard-issued clothing were all the same routine we'd done 1,000 times before, but watching him go through it felt surreal. He was, yet none of us gave him any special treatment. Here, fame meant nothing. As he made his way to his cell, the sound of his footsteps reverberated off the concrete, and other prisoners pressed their faces against the bars, watching intently. Some shouted insults, their voices brimming with derision. "I guess you're not so special." One man yelled, "Get used to it, superstar," with a smile on his face. Another Jared said, "This place doesn't care who you are." Diddy didn't flinch. Instead, he kept his head forward and his step steady, but I could see that he wasn't ignoring them out of pride. Rather, he was holding everything in an attempt to prevent himself from collapsing when he arrived at his cell. He entered without hesitation. The door clanged shut behind him, and for a moment he just stood there taking it all in. It was a small bare room with a narrow bed, a thin, stained mattress, a metal toilet bolted to the floor, and a tiny window high up on the wall. The light that came in was so dim that I watched him look towards the window, his face unreadable, then sit on the edge of the bed with his elbows resting on his knees and staring at the floor. The first few days went by in relative silence. Diddy didn't say much to the guards or the other prisoners, staying in his cell. The cafeteria wasn't much better than the rest of the detention center. The paint was peeling off on the walls, exposing patches of raw concrete underneath. The tables bolted to the floor were scratched and dented from years of abuse. The food was hardly edible, and he would emerge when he had to during meals. He would grab his tray and sit alone in the far corner of the cafeteria. He ate sparingly, just enough to keep going, though even that seemed like a struggle. The other convicts quickly lost interest in Bland because he was overdone and served on plastic trays that appeared older than some of the others. At first, his appearance was interesting, and they made fun of him and attempted to provoke him with taunts. His way, but when he didn't reply, they seemed to realize that there was nothing to gain by prodding him in certain ways, which further exacerbated his mystique. He didn't react the way other men in his position might have. There was no rage, no attempt to establish his worth. He simply lived in silence. Fading into the background, I saw how frequently he gravitated towards his cell's small window every morning. Every morning, as the dim sunlight peeked through the bars, he would stand there for a short while with his hands resting lightly on the sill. It wasn't much, just a tiny bit of light penetrating the dirt, but it seemed sufficient for him. By the end of the first month, his changes were evident. He was losing weight quickly. His uniform, which had fit him well when he arrived, now hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face had turned pale, his cheekbones were sharp against his skin, and his silence persisted. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. Rather, it was heavy and oppressive, as if he was carrying the weight of the world inside his head. At that moment, he wasn't looking for freedom or escape. All he wanted was to feel something genuine and warm on his skin in a place that felt so cut off from the outside world. I hesitated, uncertain whether to continue or listen. His voice was low, nearly whispery, but I could make out snippets of what he was saying. "I should have done it differently," he muttered, adding that none of this was worth it. For a brief minute, I remained there and saw him sitting on the side of his bed with his hands held firmly in his lap and his head lowered through the small window in his door. This was the first time I could really see the cracks in his exterior, the weight of remorse bearing down on him. The detention center itself made matters worse. The structure was collapsing, its walls were covered in graffiti, and its fissures protruded like scars. The plumbing was unreliable, the smell of mold permeated everything, and the air felt heavy and stagnant as if it had been trapped in the building for years. Fights broke out frequently, but Diddy stayed out of the fray, keeping his head down and avoiding confrontation, but the violence was inevitable. Screams and shouts reverberated through the halls, occasionally broken by the sound of fists hitting flesh. This wasn't a place for redemption. Rather, it was a place where men went to vanish and be forgotten, and wake up, shuffle to the cafeteria, eat, and then retreat to his cell, where he occasionally sits. I occasionally saw him writing on the edge of his bed while gazing at the little stack of papers he kept on his desk, but he never seemed to be satisfied with what he wrote. Instead, he would crumple the paper into a tight ball, throw it away, and begin again. By the time I passed, his floor was frequently covered in crumpled sheets. By December, Diddy's quiet routine started to reveal a visual depiction of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just his physical decline that was getting harder to ignore, but also the way the tension around him was beginning to crackle in prison. Silence and solitude can be seen as strength, but they can also make you initially. Diddy didn't react. He continued walking to his cell, ignoring the provocation, but the more he ignored them, the more persistent they became. One day, as he was sitting in his usual corner of the cafeteria, a group of inmates approached him. Target didn't like the way Diddy kept to himself, kept his head down, and kept his mouth shut to them. They saw it as arrogance and felt that he was better than the others in a place like this. One of them, a wavy man with tattoos, was creeping closer while I was standing close to the wall. He sneered, his voice loud enough to attract attention from other tables, and leaned his neck over Diddy's table. "You think you're too good to sit with us," he said. Diddy moved his fork carefully from one side of the plate to the other without looking up. "I'm talking to you, superstar," he yelled, slamming his hand down on the table. For a brief moment, Diddy hovered his fork over his food. I thought he might say something, but instead he put the fork down and pushed the tray aside. Then he stood with calm, deliberate movements, and the room fell silent as he turned to go. But before he could finish, he grabbed Diddy's shoulder and spun him around. "You don't leave me before I can intervene." Diddy's actions were well practiced. He pushed the man's hand off his shoulder and took a single step back to create space. He didn't punch or lash out. Instead, he just stood there with his stance firm and his eyes fixed on the man in front of him. There was something in his face that stopped the man cold. It wasn't anger or fear, but control. Diddy wasn't attempting to prove himself, but it was immediately apparent that he wasn't going to be pushed around. Either the man hesitated, his bravado faltering, then muttering something and backing away. As Diddy turned to leave the cafeteria, the tension in the one afternoon during the limited time the prisoners were permitted to move freely between their cells and the common areas, the room followed him like a shadow. This wasn't the last time someone attempted to test him in a setting like this, where reputation meant that backing down could be interpreted as weakness, and weakness was dangerous. When I arrived, I heard a disturbance coming from down the hall. Two men were fighting in the small corridor, and Diddy was between them and his cell. One of the men, a broad-shouldered prisoner with a scar down his cheek, was yelling, "You think you're safe in here? You think your name means anything?" Diddy simply stood there without saying anything. Returning to the wall with his arms at his sides, the scarred man stepped forward and jabbed a finger in Diddy's direction. "Did he say something, superstar, or were you just going to stand there and let me give you a lesson?" His expression was calm, but his eyes were keenly assessing the situation. Before things got out of hand, I stepped quickly in between them and barked, keeping my hand on the baton by my side as I returned to your CS. The scarred man glared at me but eventually backed off, muttering curses as he went. Diddy didn't move. Instead, he remained against the wall, his breathing steady, and his eyes followed the man until he vanished down the hall. "Are you okay?" I asked. More habitual than thoughtful, Diddy nodded once before turning and entering his cell silently. As January drew near, incidents like that began to occur more frequently, though most of them never turned into full-fledged fights. Nevertheless, the tension was evident. Some prisoners saw Diddy as an easy target, someone they could test to improve their own reputations, while others resented him for being himself. What really stood out to me, though, was how Diddy handled it. He never struck out or fought back unless he had no other option. He moved through the chaos with a quiet resilience, refusing to let the violence around him bring him down. One night, while I was making my rounds, I passed his cell and saw him. When he saw me standing there, he put the photo aside and looked up for a moment. I thought he might say something, but he just nodded slightly, an unspoken acknowledgement, before turning back to the shadows on the wall. The prison itself didn't help either, as the building was falling apart its walls. He was sitting on the floor with his back to the wall, his face lit by the faint glow of the hallway lights, and in his hands he held one of the photographs he kept tucked under his pillow. The air always had a little mildew odor, the walls were cracked and grimy, the plumbing was faulty, and even the light felt feeble here, as like it couldn't cut through the layers of decay for Diddy. It wasn't just repulsive, it was oppressive. He used to live in mansions surrounded by luxury, but now he was confined to a small cell with a narrow bed and a window that let in very little light. That window became his lifeline, and every morning he would stand by it for a few minutes with his hands on the sill and his face tilted towards the sunlight. It wasn't much, just a faint, dirty beam that cut through the bars. However, even that little bit of sunlight couldn't stop the toll that prison life was taking on him. By January, his uniform hung on his thin frame like it was made for someone twice his size. His face was pale, his cheekbones were sharp, and his once strong posture had given way to slumped shoulders that seemed to carry more than just his body weight. The prison doctor had begun to notice too. During one of the regular medical checkups, the doctor pulled me aside and said, "This guy's on the edge," he said, shaking his head as he flipped through the clipboard. He's lost more than 20 pounds since arriving, he's hardly eating, and his blood pressure is dropping. Occurs if he continues to do this, I asked, already knowing the answer, and the doctor sighed, setting the clipboard down. He said that if he doesn't start eating properly, he'll end up in the medical ward, which is not a place anyone wants to be. The medical ward was even more grim than the cells. It was a sterile, dimly lit room with inmates who couldn't care for themselves lined up on old metal carts. Most of the inmates who ended up there didn't recover mentally or physically, and the doctor leaned against the counter, massaging his temples. I've seen guys like him before. They don't fight, they just fade hearing. It struck me more forcefully than I anticipated. I remained silent, but later that day I noticed that I was observing Diddy more intently. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at the small stack of crumpled papers he kept on the floor. He appeared disoriented, as if he lacked the strength to pick one up and start over. The following morning, I saw that he hadn't left for breakfast right away, and when I passed his cell, he was standing by the window once more, his hands resting on the sill, his face tilted towards the sun, and his eyes half closed. For a brief moment he appeared content, as if he was somewhere else, but then he turned away and sat down heavily on the bed, moving slowly and deliberately. By mid-January, the rumors about Diddy had grown louder, spreading from guards to the prisoners, and everyone was thinking the same thing. Diddy's decline had become more than just apparent. It was concerning. Every step he took was slower, his frame more fragile, and the aura of defeat hung heavier around him. Diddy might not make it to his trial if this keeps up. The signs were all over the place. He hardly touched his food anymore, and when he did, it hardly stayed down. The retching noises coming from his cell became almost nightly. He avoided assistance from others, even from the few inmates who did reach out to him, like Cruz. His silence was deafening his isolation completely. The prison doctor's words still reverberated in my mind. He's shutting down, it's not just his body but his mind. If this keeps up, he'll end up in the medical ward. Even worse, the medical ward was the last stop for many prisoners. It was a dim, cold room full of cots, and the smell of antiseptic couldn't cover the underlying stench of despair. Few inmates ever really left that ward, and it was easy to picture Diddy there, slipping farther and farther away until nothing remained. Even the inmates who had once made fun of him had become quiet, some of them speaking in hushed tones as they passed his cell, their voices tinged with a mix of both morbid curiosity and sympathy. "He won't make it," I heard one of them say. Before the trial even began, another prisoner nodded and looked towards Diddy's cell. It seemed like he was already gone, as if he was just waiting. That night, as I was making my rounds, I found myself stopping outside Diddy's cell once more. He was sitting on the floor, his back to the wall, staring at the picture he always kept close. His face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light, and his breathing was shallow. With each rise and fall of his cheese, I watched as he tilted his head back, allowing the light to filter through the bars of a small window near the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. For a moment, he almost appeared calm, as if he were far away from here, but then he shifted his shoulders, slumping further, and the fragile illusion was destroyed. I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. What could I possibly say to a man who had already lost so much? I left, the sound of his shallow breathing following me down the hall by now. Even though Diddy's trial is still 3 months away, it feels more like an abstract than a reality. The man who entered this prison in October with his head held high and his name still carrying weight is gone, leaving behind a person who has lost everything: his pride, his strength, and even his ability to continue. If this story gave you a glimpse into the thin line separating power and vulnerability, like this video, I think we all know how this story will end. Given the way he's deteriorating, it's difficult to imagine him making it that far. Thank you for watching, remain safe, and never forget that nobody is invincible. You can also subscribe to the channel here, where we share the unvarnished, uncut tale that the world seldom ever sees.